Okay, hi, welcome to Letting the Light In session 3, and we are broadcasting live on Periscope and on Facebook Live, I hope. I'm just going to wait a few minutes until we've got some more people watching before we go into the subject of today's discussion, which is going to be broadly around tough love. These question and answer sessions are live and deliberately open so that people can ask their own questions, but we always think it's good to have a theme. Hi Penny, hi, nice to see you there. So just briefly, I'm Sarah Graham. I'm an addiction therapist from the United Kingdom, as you can probably tell by the accent, although I'm here today in Los Angeles. So it's actually 12 midday in Los Angeles and 8 p.m. in the United Kingdom. Others of you may be joining from other countries, and that's great. And I've been working as an addiction therapist since qualifying at Priory Healthcare in 2005. Before that, just to give you a little bit of background, I was in active addiction myself from the age of 12 years old until 2001, December the 12th, 2001, when I was fortunate to have the opportunity to go into rehab and actually ended up being in residential rehab in the UK for 9 months. And so I have obviously a lot of personal and professional experience in that time of what it's like to have an addiction, and that addiction can be to substances or it can be to behaviours. I personally believe that addiction is an illness that affects every area of a person's being. It's not just about the actual physical substance relationship, the kind of physical dependency, and that is a slightly different perspective to the one that you may encounter from doctors or from other people within the NHS, which is still very much a medical model of addiction, about physical dependency and detoxing you from that physical dependency, rather than necessarily addressing the psychological drivers of addiction. So I haven't seen any comments come up on Facebook Live yet, so if anybody is out there on Facebook Live and can just say hello or send some hearts or likes or anything, just so I know that that's working correctly, I'd very much appreciate it. I can see that Periscope seems to be working correctly. Hi Penny, I can see that you're there. Would you send me a question or post a comment just so I can see that that's working and that we have interactivity? Otherwise this is going to be 50 minutes of me talking at you, which could be interesting or perhaps not. So I'd just like to see that the technology is working. Still nothing coming up as yet. I'm just going to quickly check. The internet here in Los Angeles is usually very good, but let's just make sure that's working. Hello Penny, I can see just the word you. If you could send me a question, that would be great. And as we get into the flow of the discussion today, questions do come in quite quickly sometimes. I will write the ones down that I catch. If I don't pick up your question and it seems like I've missed it, please do write it again, don't be shy. Also, in terms of the issue, okay, that's interesting. Let me just, I think there may be a problem with Facebook Live. Let me just very quickly see if I'm, it says that I'm live on Facebook Live. No, I think I should be live on Facebook Live. It may be a technical problem your end, Penny, but I would appreciate if there is anybody on Facebook Live who could send me a question, just so we can see that that's definitely functioning. So yes, in terms of the theme of today, tough love. Tough love is an expression that many of you might have heard, but it's quite a controversial topic in the fact that different people do mean different things with it. And also, Letting the Light In as a blog is obviously aimed at parents and carers, grandparents, and loved ones of those in earlier addiction. And okay, I've noted that. Thank you, Penny. And when dealing with younger people, there are obviously complicating factors. For example, a younger person is dependent on parents usually, or a parent, for where they live, whereas when you're dealing with an adult child, the issues are slightly different. But we hopefully will have time to address all the different dimensions. So Penny just asked me as a first question, when are things bad enough to start invoking tough love? Okay, well, first of all, tough love, just to give you a very brief kind of introduction to this, and there is a new blog post on Letting the Light In that you can read. And also, this is a fantastic book, which I've mentioned before on these broadcasts, but this really does say a lot more about tough love than we're going to be able to say here today. Love First by the Jays is a fantastic source of reading material. Basically, though, the principle is that obviously as a parent or as a grandparent or as a loved one of somebody with an addiction, you want to help that person. You can see that they are sick. Often that you can see that they are sick before the person themselves can see that they have a problem. Denial is a huge part of the illness of addiction. It's a way that the brain protects ourselves from the reality of situations, and the denial process is very useful if you're living in a cave and confronting woolly mammoths every day, but is not so useful when you're living in the Western world or living in an industrialized society, and you're using a substance to numb pain, to not face issues, to avoid your life in some way, to suppress feelings that you have because maybe you've been bullied, or maybe you've been sexually abused, or maybe you're struggling at school or whatever. So tough love is it's building on the theme of love, and one of the things that parents often find so difficult when they start speaking to people like me, a qualified addiction therapist, is that the things that we suggest to parents seem to be the complete opposite of what parents think is love. Obviously, if you feel that your child is at risk, for example, and to deal in worst case scenarios for a moment, one of the big ones that comes up, and this is one of the kind of real hot potato issues, is if your young person comes to you and says that they have been buying drugs from a drug dealer on the streets, and that they have accrued a debt with this drug dealer, which is something that drug dealers do let people do deliberately, then they are feeling that they are, or maybe they actually know that they're being threatened for not paying off that debt. And then the parent is presented with that horrible situation of knowing that their young person has a debt with a probably fairly unscrupulous person, and they can make that problem go away by paying it off, or not paying it off, as will probably be the suggestion from somebody like myself. Now, another thing that we need to know about people who have substance dependencies or who are trapped in any kind of an addiction, especially one that requires money to keep it going, and it could be a gambling addiction, it could be a pornography addiction, and young people are experiencing online gambling addictions and online pornography addictions. We live in a very different world to the world that the parents and the grandparents' generation grew up in. So if the young person is struggling with an addiction, it can be very tempting to kind of pay off that debt and hope that that the fact that the young person has had to come to you and ask for help will be the factor that creates the change. Now, the reality is that often when it's got to that stage that a young person will even make it visible to you that there is some kind of a problem, this is probably a scenario that's been going on for some time, completely out of your awareness, or you may have known on some level that something was happening, but had gone into your own denial process and denied it to yourself, that your young person was getting involved in something like this, and you may have bought into the excuses that have been given to you. Okay, so I think to kind of set the backdrop for this situation, we need to know that as an addiction therapist and as somebody with an addiction that nearly killed them in its latter stages, I can tell you categorically that addiction is a life-threatening illness that does end in jails, institutions, and death if untreated. That is a phrase that comes from Narcotics Anonymous. And I think it's really worth knowing that and thinking about that in terms of everything else that you take on from this point on, and weighing up the decisions that you as a parent or you as a family member need to make. So if we know and if we genuinely believe in our hearts that addiction is that serious, that it does end in jails, institutions, and death when it progresses to the latter stages, then we can start to think more clearly about some of the things that we may need to do in the earlier stages of addiction. It's also worth knowing that things may not be that bad yet. And going back to the question that Penny asked, at what stage we start employing tough love? Well, it may be that things don't seem to be that out of control yet. It may be that there are only one or two things that seem to be going awry. But it's worth knowing that these situations are far better nipped in the bud now and dealt with and getting to the underlying causes rather than waiting for this to progress. One of the things which I love that the Jays say, and this was really controversial for a while, is that if I read it from the book here, if alcoholics and addicts won't accept help until they're ready, what gets them ready? And they seek to dispel two damaging myths: that an addict has to hit bottom and that intervention must be confrontational. Well, this was the old school thinking, that you can't intervene and you can't speed up the person hitting the rock bottom, as it's called. And I'm sorry, I probably will use a lot of terminology from the addiction world and therapeutic terms. If you don't understand any of those, please do just make a note of them and Google them. I will try and not get too into lingo and kind of demystify things as we go along, but because I've been in this world for a while, I may say things which seem perfectly normal to me but which sound strange to you. So I'll try not to be too kind of odd sounding in the way that I communicate this. But yes, so the theory used to be that a person had to be left to hit their bottom and that there was nothing you could do, that you just needed to detach with love, that's another buzz phrase, and let them get on with it, not help them in terms of not fund their situation or just kind of not try and control them, but just kind of let them go out there and do what they need to do until it gets bad enough for them. Well, that's all very well, but as I said, addiction ends in jails, institutions and death, and the world is very different to the world of Alcoholics Anonymous. When this book was written in the 1930s in America, it was a book that, although it describes the illness of alcoholism, which is an illness that, as they say in here, the bottle is but a symbol. It's not actually about the substance, it's about the illness that underlies the use of substances. The reality was that for those largely white men in America in the 1930s, alcohol was the primary substance. I mean, there are a couple of stories in here about people abusing prescription drugs as well, but it was mainly alcohol. Now, alcohol, as we know, and alcoholism is a devastating illness that really will take you down physically, that can create a physical dependency, which is an incredibly serious physical dependency, and if you just suddenly go cold turkey, you have a very good chance of fitting and dying, which is why it's very important, if you do have an alcohol dependency, that you see a doctor or you see a hospital or you go into a detox unit and actually be taken off alcohol in a steady way, usually with a substance like Librium, to make sure that you don't fit. Okay, the situation today is so different to the situation in the 1930s. We now live in a world, obviously, with the internet. I'm broadcasting to you all live on the internet. It's a wonderful thing when used correctly, but it does mean that a young person anywhere in the world, in Lapland or in the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, or in the middle of nowhere in the Midwest, a young person can access substances via the internet which can kill them. And especially when they are used in what we call a polysubstance way. Young people really don't tend to just use one substance these days in the way that it used to be the case. Quite often you see young people mixing a cocktail of substances, and quite often a cocktail that they have no idea what they're mixing together and what the interactions are, and probably nobody does have any clear idea of what the possible dangers and interactions are, because a lot of the substances that are being sold on the internet, on the dark web, and sold on the streets via the black market now in the UK, that we've finally shut the door on legal highs, thank goodness. A lot of those substances have no evidence base in terms of the interactions, and any young person that's taking them is basically being a laboratory rat, and we do see unexpected reactions. So, as long as a young person is using these substances, there is the very real risk of an overdose, of something happening physically which could have life-changing consequences, or indeed developing a dependency. Some of the substances which came out and which were massively abused by young people, I'm thinking of methadone, for example, Meow Meow as it was known, or Bubble, which was a cathinone, that seemed at first to be a relatively not particularly harmful drug in terms of the numbers who are using it and the numbers ending up in ER or A&E, as we say in England. But we found relatively quickly that it was a very dependency-inducing substance, psychologically very dependency-inducing, and we now have a lot of young people who are not only addicted to it, but even injecting that substance and combining it with other substances like synthetic meth, synthetic crystal meth, synthetic cannabinoids. And so I would say this is a long way, sorry, I can go around the houses to get to my point, but I hope you'll bear with me. This is a long way of saying that the world is a much more dangerous place. You know, and that's not hyperbole. The world is a much more dangerous place for young drug users these days. And the charity drug fam, which Letting the Light In and I are big fans of, a wonderful charity in England, which is expanding across the UK, and which has a memorial service in May, which I'll get the date for that actually, because that's something that everybody should know about. Drug Fam will testify just how many families are affected by the very, very sad loss of a person to an overdose or a substance-related death. Unfortunately, as a society, we don't really know that reality or deal with that reality. The media very rarely covers it unless it's a particularly pretty young white girl. Then they might talk about it and give it some tabloid columns. But we see a lot of gay men, for example, dying of GHB overdoses. We see a lot of young people ending up in A&E as a consequence of former legal highs. So when you know all of this, when you know the reality of what's going on out there, it becomes important to do everything you can to use any lever that you have to take action. And to go back to this question again, you may not need to set a very definite tough love boundary initially. You may not have something as serious as a drug debt which you're being asked to pay off, but you might need to set new consequences in the home to reflect the seriousness of the situation as you see it. And something else which I always say, and I've said this before on this Letting the Light In broadcast, it's also important not to go in there kind of, I mean, one reason why tough love has had some bad press over the years is because in America, some of the rehabs here have interpreted tough love in a way which is very kind of militaristic and kind of harking back to that kind of idea of national service, and put young men especially in uniform and make them march around and shout at them a lot and all of that kind of stuff. And so that is one of the reasons why tough love has some negative connotations for some people. And I think it's very important actually to kind of distinguish between boundary setting and a focus on love. I think the word love is as important as the word tough in that phrase. And those examples I just talked about, they're not coming from a place of much love. And actually, we also need to know that those young people who are developing early dependencies and who are really acting out in ways that are very obvious to the school, to the parents, or to the friendship group, usually have some very big issues going on underneath the surface. And it could be something serious like online bullying. It could be something serious like encountering some kind of a sexual predator, or some kind of an abuse history that's coming to light. So it's really important that we don't add more trauma to the trauma. If the person has a trauma wound, and many of the people that I work with as an addiction therapist do have multiple trauma wounds of one kind or another, and their abuse of substances or their use of addictions has been to help themselves feel better, to comfort themselves, to make themselves feel better. Tough love very much needs to be coming from a loving place, not just a tough place. I hope that answered that question. I'm glad to see that Facebook Live is working, although I haven't received any questions from Facebook Live yet. I know that one of the issues that people have watching this broadcast is if this is an issue that does really affect you and your family, you may feel that communicating via social media is not the best way in terms of obviously your anonymity as a family and your anonymity in terms of in terms of the young people. And I completely understand that. As a therapist, confidentiality is vital. Creating that space of trust and safety is absolutely vital if people are going to talk from an honest place. So we have been working to help those people who can't, it is obviously possible to set up a Twitter account that's anonymous, which means that you can then set up a Periscope account, which is account which is anonymous. Facebook is a little bit more tricky, but again, it can be done. But if that doesn't work for you, you can actually go on the Letting the Light In blog, and you can send anonymous questions, which will then be sent to me ahead of the broadcast, and we can then get those questions asked for you. And that would actually be really helpful to me as well, because I can tell you it's pretty scary to sit here with 50 minutes ahead and not knowing what you're going to be facing. And last session, if you go back on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, and have a look at the last session, we did get some curveballs, which were good, but quite difficult to deal with in time. Okay, I've got a couple coming in here. Is tough love the same thing as detaching with love? Jessica. Okay, thank you, Jessica. That's a very good question. Detaching with love. Okay, I'm going to address detaching with love first, briefly, and then come on to Jessica's question. Okay, detaching with love. Detaching with love is I would say it comes under the heading of tough love. It's one of the things that you might need to do in the process of the tough love boundary or tough love consequence taking effect. It's really important to know that we can't force a young person to do anything. Obviously, one of the fears that adults have is that if they take a very strong action, and that strong action may be something as apparently simple as withdrawing a PlayStation machine or switching off the internet at a reasonable time, and that can lead to angry outbursts, threats of physical violence, extreme behaviours. It's important to know that some of these substances that young people are using, and I even include synthetic cannabis and even herbal cannabis of the strongest strains that have been grown in the last 20 years, can cause emotional dysregulation in a young person's brain. Their brain is still forming, their emotional centres and their intellectual centres are still working out how to work with each other, and these brains can disrupt that process. And so parents often think that cannabis, for example, isn't really that serious a substance, and don't worry too much when they hear that their young person is smoking strong strains of cannabis, because they think it's going to be just, a slightly stronger version than what they had at college. Well, that's really not the case. Stronger strains of cannabis act on the brain very differently, and we are seeing that these strains especially affect young people very differently to the old school kinds of cannabis. So it's really important to take those issues seriously. I've written a blog which you can see on Holistic Therapist magazine website, which is called Skunk Cannabis, A Therapist's Opinion. Skunk Cannabis, A Therapist's Opinion. If you haven't read that blog, please do. You can also find a link on the Letting the Light In blog, which will take you, I believe, to that blog that I wrote some time ago now, but it still very much stands true. So going back to this question, detaching with love. After you've looked at the situation that you have, and you've looked at and identified the levers that you have with that young person, and you've set in motion changing your behaviour and setting some very firm boundaries, and also setting some consequences that are going to really bite, and really, and you've really worked all of the different carrot and stick kind of approaches that you have, you then may need to get to a point where you detach with love. And detaching with love is saying to the young person, we love you, of course, you're our family member, you're our son, you're our daughter, we love you and we will always support you and want the best for you, but we cannot do whatever it is that we're doing, or we cannot provide whatever it is that we've been providing for for you whilst you're still insisting on hanging on to whatever it is that the person's doing. And then it's about kind of emotionally withdrawing and looking after yourselves. And this is especially important for those family members, for those families where there are other children at home. I can't tell you how harmful it is to younger siblings, especially when there is an addicted teenager in the house, doing things like shouting, screaming, banging the doors, being emotionally or physically abusive to parents. That is traumatic to adults. It's traumatic to the grown-ups in the family, but it's incredibly traumatic for younger siblings, especially, to see the person that they looked up to formerly go through such a change process. When somebody becomes dependent, or when somebody starts abusing substances regularly, the person that you know and love can transform, and sometimes that transformation process can happen very quickly. It can almost feel a bit like a demon has taken over, in terms of you may have somebody who one day is loving and kind in the person that you know, and then shows up the next day or the next evening or the next morning behaving in completely unrecognizable ways, to the point that you know it's the same person physically, but it just doesn't feel like the person that you know. And that can be very disturbing. And in an ideal situation, all family members would get support to deal with that. And being around that kind of dependent behavior, or that kind of emotionally volatile behavior, is very damaging to the whole family, and very corrupting to the whole family system. And it's really advisable for parents to get support. There are great support networks out there which are completely free. I've mentioned Drug Fam, and there's another charity called AdFam in the UK. And then there are the Al-Anon family groups. That's AL-ANON. Now, Al-Anon initially started to support loved ones of somebody with an alcohol addiction, but like AA, it's expanded to recognize the illness of addiction. And so Al-Anon groups, on the whole, should be open to people going along whose maybe their child is not abusing alcohol but might be abusing other drugs. Okay, and this ties in quite nicely with Jessica's question. Hi Jessica, lovely to see you here. So you have a dear friend whose brother is a drug addict and who's gone cold turkey. Well, first of all, I wouldn't recommend to anybody that they go cold turkey because of the risks attached to that, medical risks attached to that. But as an addict myself, who did go cold turkey, although not off heroin, which is the drug we usually think of in terms of cold turkey, but certainly with alcohol, I just suddenly would stop drinking, which was probably dangerous. Anyway. If you've got a person around you who's in that situation, they have got to that point of feeling sick and tired of being sick and tired, and that point of desperation where they recognize that as long as they're using substances, it's the same old, and they just feel completely trapped. You are not going to be able to sustain that behavior change on your own, and that's a really, really important message for everybody out there. I'm in a position where I work with a whole range of people in society and internationally via Skype, and I can tell you it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're the CEO of a country, a CEO of a company, the president of a country, or whether you are homeless in a park in Los Angeles. This illness is bigger than any one individual. And actually those people who you might think are going to have an easier time of it, you know, the celebrity person, the person who has the financial resources to pick up the phone and just go into rehab whenever they want, actually those people can have an even more challenging time, because on the surface everything looks like it's okay, and it's easy to go back into your own personal denial process. In terms of understanding the psychology of addiction, and in terms of understanding the neuroscience of addiction, we have so much more evidence to look at, and we are building up such a better picture of the brain in the last 10 or 15 years, that we can really now see what's going on in a brain sense. And when somebody has an addiction, they literally have a battle going on between different areas of their brain. I'm not a neuroscientist, so please excuse the simplicity of this, but the prefrontal cortex is this area of the brain up here, and that's where your personality is, and that's where the bit of you that decides that you want to change and that can think rationally and logically, and that bit of you can write down the pros and cons list. And there may be many people in the audience who've done this with cigarettes, or even, you know, with chocolate, or if you're trying to lose weight. You know, you can sit there and you can write very clearly all the reasons why you need to do this thing, whatever it is. You know, I know there's lots of people out there, because it's Lent, who gave up things for Lent, and they may have very good reasons, you know, including, you know, a good spiritual reason to be doing something. But then something will happen, and it could be something quite simple, like your boss says something to you that annoys you, or, you know, your boyfriend doesn't return your text, or it could be something big, of course. But that creates a feeling in you, and that feeling is a trigger for doing whatever it is that you're trying to resist. Now, if you have a long established addiction, or if you're addicted to one of these substances that can create a powerful physical as well as psychological craving, then it's nigh on impossible to resist some of the kind of strength of feelings that you're going to experience in early recovery. And you know, because you've proved it to yourself so many times, that you can end this, especially with people who are addicted to opiates. And there's so many people in the United States addicted to opiates, and I could really get on my soapbox at this point in terms of prescription drug abuse and the role of big pharma and doctors for misprescribing. Thank goodness we haven't gone down that path in England and Great Britain, but the internet means that is a possibility for any country, so nobody can be complacent. But we have a whole generation of young people here who have opiate addictions, and a lot of these people have no choice sometimes but to go into cold turkey, because they get to a point where their habit is just not sustainable financially. You know, these pills can cost way in excess of anything a young person can earn. Some of these young people, of course, are going to turn to horrible means for getting the access to the drugs that they need, and then they have to deal with the trauma of realizing the next day what it is that they did to earn that $100 to pay for that day's drugs. So basically what I'm trying to say to you, Jessica, and say to your friend, is it's really important, if you are getting to the place where you want to do behavior change, that you start building a support structure. And this is why Letting the Light In is such an important blog, and why it's really important to get on the internet and start Google local support structures. You know, it varies from country to country what's available. In the United States, they have an incredible range of treatment service providers. They're very blessed in that sense, and it's not just about the wealthy going to rehab in this country in the way that some people in Europe may think. Actually, there are rehabs priced at all sorts of different levels. Yes, you can go and stay in Malibu and spend, you know, goodness knows how many thousands a night to be there, but there are much more kind of simple but good treatment programs available. Obviously, not everybody does need to go to rehab, and with young people, we would hope that we can intervene and deal with the issues before rehab becomes necessary, because going to rehab is removing you from the situation, which can be very good, but at the same time, you also have to go back into your community at the end of that. And for a young person, being away from the family, being away from loved ones, being away from family pets, being away from one's education, all of that can be traumatic in itself. So it may be that you need to, if you can, access a counsellor who's going to support you. Even just a weekly counselling session can make a very big difference in terms of knowing that you have that accountability to yourself, and also that accountability with your counsellor, that you're going to sit there and you're going to make goals. You're going to come up with ways that you're going to deal with your cravings and triggers. Just gaining that insight. It's a bit. I'm just going to have a sip of my coconut water. So I'm just getting a dry throat. There is a little bit of a contradiction here, which is, in this world of addiction, knowledge is power, certainly, and many people don't know about addiction. Unfortunately, many doctors don't know about addiction. Thank you, Penny. I've noted that. I'll say that in a second. But many people who have been using substances themselves may not even know what the substance really is, what's in that substance, and what it's doing to them physically. If you want to change your behavior, it's really valuable to educate yourself. You know, I know a lot of people with smoking, one of the things that they will do is they really kind of look at the facts of what they're doing to themselves physically and the kind of toxicity that they're putting into their body. But at the same time, all of that knowledge isn't enough. And this can be one of the great sources of shame for people struggling with addiction, especially, for example, a mother who carries on using substances, maybe carries on drinking heavily in pregnancy, knowing that there's a risk of fetal alcohol symptom, or obviously the most common one is a mother who swore to herself that she would stop smoking if she became pregnant, and then finds that she's actually feeling super stressed being pregnant, that being sick a lot and maybe having relationship problems or whatever the reasons are, are the pressing all of the buttons of the cravings and triggers that she's historically turned to smoking for. And so she may find herself smoking and doing it secretly, and so then having all of the shame around that. Just so I don't forget, thank you, Penny, for reminding me that Action on Addiction, which is a wonderful charity in the UK, have really excellent 5-day family workshops, which are there to help family members learn how to deal with addiction in the family. You can Google them. And though if you are in the UK, those workshops really are excellent. I know I've had clients who've gone to those workshops and then who've passed that knowledge on. The blog Letting the Light In is written by a parent who has been through this process themselves, and who has really taken advantage of all of the kind of things that were suggested in terms of things like this course, and pulled all that information together. Despite the fact that there's a lot of knowledge now accumulating about addiction, and it's a very exciting field in terms of new developments and refinements, and some treatment programs have excellent outcomes, there is no perfect solution to this. There is no, I can't say to you, even if you have all the money in the world, I can't say to you, go to X rehab and guarantee you that the person who goes there will successfully complete the treatment program, and even if they do, that they will stay clean for the rest of their lives. Addiction is an illness that we talk about as being a chronic illness that does affect people for their whole life. Again, to go back to smokers, most smokers will have had that experience of maybe giving up for as much as a year or even longer, and then having that first puff, and then finding that they're going back to 20 a day or whatever their habit was before. And that's true for all addictions. You can learn a lot about how addiction works by looking at smokers and what happens with smoking. And a really important message from that is that it's the first puff or drink or sniff of a powder or pill that does the damage. Once you take that mood altering substance into your system, then you're going to relight the fire of the addiction. Sorry, I didn't finish my description of the brain. So we have the prefrontal cortex, which is where that rational part of the brain is, and then the addiction is actually based in the amygdala, which is the old reptilian base of the brain. That's a much older part of the brain, and that's where the instinctual drives are located. So the drives for food, for water, for being in a temperature that's not going to kill you, for sex. So those very, very powerful drives, those survival drives, are based in the amygdala. And so for somebody who has an addiction, it can actually feel like their very survival depends on using the substance or using the behaviour. And I think it's really important that, sorry, my chair is a bit squeaky, isn't it? It's really important to know that addiction can take many, many forms. If I have a little pamphlet that I wrote on addiction and holistic recovery, which I can send to anybody who's interested. And in that, there's an addiction tree, which has all of the different branches that addiction can take, including relationship addictions, things like codependency, sex and love addiction, addiction to emotions even, addiction to money, avoidance addictions. There's one word that unites all addictions in terms of kind of giving some insight and understanding into what's going on. That one word is a C word, and it's control. All addiction is about trying to control your feelings, trying to control those feelings that you don't want to have, and trying to feel feelings that you do want to have. So it's about manipulating your emotional landscape. So instead of being open to the kind of the weather system that is our emotional world, which is kind of dependent on our environment and our circumstances and whatever's happening in terms of our own health and well-being and our family's health and well-being and wealth and all of those other factors. Instead of just kind of experiencing life and being in the moment and in the day and dealing with life on life's terms, addiction is a compulsive and obsessive way of trying to control that emotional landscape, and to stay in a comfortable place. And that comfortable place can look different for different people. Some people's comfortable places are very numbed out, very disengaged, kind of alone in their bedroom, watching Netflix or playing computer games or whatever. Another person's comfortable place might be a very manic place, might be a very active social place, but it's a way of avoiding what's actually going on and the reality that they're facing. Okay, I feel like I've covered quite a lot there. We're on the last sort of 8 minutes or so. Has anybody got another question relating to tough love that I haven't covered, or anything that's come up from anything that I've said so far? While I'm waiting for that to come in, I'll just say it's also worth recognizing that different things cause addiction. And one of the things that makes my job as an addiction therapist so interesting, aside from the fact I get to work with such a range of people, is that I never see two people who've got exactly the same configuration of factors creating their addiction. And also every person's response to the knowledge of their addiction is different. I don't believe that there's one care plan that works for even a group of people. I work a lot with the LGBT community, or I have worked a lot with the LGBT community. And I've worked with other communities. I love working with young people because it's a very dynamic process, and you really can help a young person kind of identify what's going on and then kind of affect change very quickly, and hopefully they haven't built up too much of a trauma history, so they haven't got a lot of kind of deep processing work that then needs to happen. Whereas working with an older person, they might have had a whole lifetime of addiction, they might have failed marriages, they might have children that they don't see. There's a whole load of different things to work with. Questions just come in. Okay, great question. Is tough love appropriate for somebody with mental health issues? So this, as well as addiction. First of all, addiction is a mental health issue because it's a controversial mental health issue for some psychiatrists, and certainly within the National Health Service in Britain, it's not viewed in the same way as other more kind of biologically proven kinds of mental illnesses. But it is very much a mental illness. It's very much based on the brain and how we respond and how we think, or how we deal with things emotionally or don't deal with things emotionally. So that's the first thing. Addiction, AA, I held up this book earlier, this is the AA big book. AA has the 12 steps, which some of you may have heard of, which are actually a wonderful psychological program for dealing with the past, dealing with the damage of the past, accepting one's addiction, and then moving on. And then the latter steps are a kind of daily process of how to live your life, what to do to lessen your stress, what to do to make sure you're not behaving in ways that you then build up shame or feel guilty about, and so therefore want to return to addiction. In this book, though, even though this was written in the 1930s, in chapter 5, which is such a powerful chapter for those affected by addiction, whether it's addiction to alcohol or whether it's addiction to other things, it talks about people who have other mental illnesses. I'll just read a little bit of this actually. Those who do not recover are people who cannot or will not completely give themselves to this simple program, usually men and women who are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. There are such unfortunates. They are not at fault. They seem to have been born that way. They are naturally incapable of grasping and developing a manner of living which demands rigorous honesty. Their chances are less than average. There are those too who suffer from grave emotional and mental disorders, but many of them do recover if they have the capacity to be honest. I really think that's the case. Yes, having a dual diagnosis situation can make treatment more complicated. It may well be that somebody who is a dual diagnosis person, and when I'm talking about dual diagnosis, some of the other diagnoses they might have are things like depression, anxiety disorders, bipolar, also known as manic depression. I'm half Scottish. I had my brain analysed by Best Brain Solutions, and there are two different ways that your brain can be prone to addictions: a tendency towards depression and a tendency towards compulsivity. I'm one of those lucky people that I have both the tendency towards depression and the tendency towards compulsivity. So consequently, I have had to go on antidepressants at various points in my life. And it's important to know that some psychiatric medications may be necessary if you have a dual diagnosis situation. If your anxiety or your depression is so crippling and so disabling that you can't actually get out of bed to go and attend an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, or attend a Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous meeting, or go and see your doctor, or go and see your rabbi, or go and take part in your five-a-side football, whatever it is, then that of course is going to make your recovery much more challenging and much more difficult, and so you will need possibly to have some medication to help you, certainly through the first year or two of recovery. I think it's important to know that that a lot of the mental illnesses that accompany addiction and that the person may get diagnosed with in early recovery, I've seen many people where when they've really worked an active program of recovery using all of the tools that are suggested in terms of exercise, meditation, developing a spiritual life, whatever that looks like, just having a life that's connected to other people and that has meaning and that is of service to other people. We build self-worth by doing esteemable acts. All of these very simple tools that often were built into kind of older societies, but which have been lost in our modernization and industrialization process. If you use these other tools, many of these psychiatric illnesses can clear up. And, there are tools like neuroengineering is a fantastic tool that can really help actually physically heal the brain. It's been proven to people who use crystal meth, very quickly their brains can show physical signs of damage. People who use cocaine very heavily, people like myself who have used alcohol way too heavily from a young age. I have memory damage from my teenage binge drinking. I was fortunate to be able to go through the process of neuroengineering and actually see my brain map before and after going through that treatment modality, and saw the improvement and felt the improvement. So to bring this back to your question, in terms of can tough love be used in these situations, yes, it absolutely can. And yes, it might well be very necessary. I have had the experience of working with people who are under sections in a mental health institution. And that is a nightmare scenario for parents, having their young person locked up in a psychiatric hospital under a mental health section. And often these environments are completely inappropriate places for especially young people to be. They are locked up with people who've got a whole range of mental health challenges, and it can be very traumatizing to be in these environments. However, I have worked with people in these facilities and one thing that of course is really important to know is that just because you're locked up in a psychiatric facility doesn't mean that you don't have access to drugs. Both mood-altering drugs that are prescribed by doctors and psychiatrists, sometimes who don't understand addiction and don't understand, for example, that prescribing a benzodiazepine, yes, it may make the patient more relaxed and more compliant and easier to manage on the ward, but it's also going to keep them in a state of craving for other substances that they are addicted to. So the treatment that you receive may actually be counter the appropriate treatment to manage the addiction. However, with the right therapeutic support, and obviously if you're a wealthier parent, this is something you can do, which you may not be able to do if you don't have financial resources, but you can ask somebody like myself to go and work with the person in the psychiatric facility and help them get to a place of motivation to stay substance free, even if people are using around them. And then often you will see that the mental health of that patient will improve dramatically to the point that they can be allowed out into the community to go and attend Narcotics Anonymous meetings. And this is going back to Jessica's point. Jessica, you may not be with us still, but the 12-step groups, and there are so many different fellowships now: Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous, Al-Anon, Overeaters Anonymous, which covers eating disorders, CODA, which covers codependency. All of these different fellowships have meetings all over the world, Alcoholics Anonymous being by far the biggest fellowship, and these meetings are actually free. And that's one thing that you can do, that you can really suggest and even maybe take a young person to. In the United States, we are very, very spoiled because there are so many young people's rehabs here. It's very common to have actual young people's AA meetings, young people's NA meetings. And of course, it's good for young people to be around other young people who are in recovery. And I've been fortunate to lecture for Boston University in London on about addiction, and quite often I will see 18 to 22-year-old young people there who had the ability or had the opportunity to go to rehab as a young teenager, and who are now completely functioning, back in education, etc., etc. So that treatment early is very important in terms of then creating the role models who young people can relate to, and who can show that it is possible to be a young person who isn't using substances, and that doesn't have to have a good, doesn't have to use substances, doesn't have to take part in beer pong and all of the other things that can happen at university to have a good time. And again, in the States, we are in the lucky position of having sober colleges. And if there are any entrepreneurs out there watching this broadcast, or any philanthropists who are interested in helping young people, especially with addictions, we desperately need some sober colleges across Europe, and we also desperately need an accessible residential rehab for teenagers in the UK. It is completely inappropriate to be putting teenagers who have a cannabis dependency in a ward that doesn't really address or understand their addiction. And so that is something I'm very passionate about. Now, I think that we are 1 minute over time. I hope that has covered the topic in a way that's been useful to those people watching. This is going to be uploaded to the YouTube channel that I have. With my YouTube channel is Sarah G Directs. You can subscribe there and see that. There will be a link from the Letting the Light In blog. If you haven't had a chance yet to go to Letting the Light In, please do, because it's a daily, weekly growing blog. If you've been there a few weeks ago, go back there, because honestly, they're doing a great job of adding new content all the time. There's some wonderful content with Tommy Rosen, who is an amazing person who's been in recovery for a long time, and who's at the cutting edge of using yoga and holistic body work in conjunction with psychological tools to help people heal and live vibrant, happy lives. I'm going to have to leave it there, but I hope, as I say, I hope that's been useful. If you want to email me directly, if you've got a private question you'd like to ask, you can email me Sarah with an H at sarahgrahamsolutions.com. That's Sarah at sarahgrahamsolutions.com. I am in the United States until May, when I will be coming back for the Drug Fam service that I mentioned earlier, and I do want to give you that date, because if you are in the UK and you've lost anybody to addiction, or you've been affected by addiction, and you would derive comfort from a service at Westminster Abbey, and this is the first time this has ever been done, and I'm so happy that Westminster Abbey are giving their beautiful cathedral to do this, because so many families are affected by addiction. There's such shame around addiction, and that has to change. Addiction is an illness like any other, and losing your child to addiction is just as painful, if in some senses more painful, than losing your child to cancer or any of these other illnesses. And yet parents feel that they can't talk about it. So hopefully this service, which is on May the 9th, Tuesday, May the 9th at noon, will really help to wake Britain up to the fact that addiction is an illness. It's a treatable illness, but unfortunately people do die, and we need to do as much as we can to raise awareness about that. So please, if you can't actually attend that event yourself, and if you're not a Christian, don't worry. It's actually open to people of all faiths. They're looking to build bridges and community. It's not about just being a Christian. They're just opening up their fantastic facility. You can get full details for that from Drug Fam. Elizabeth Burton Phillips, who set up that charity, is an angel on earth as far as I'm concerned, a beautiful, beautiful lady. She had a meeting at Downing Street a couple of days ago, and the government are putting their support behind it, which I'm really happy to see. So I'm coming back to the UK for that, and for my last advisory council on the misuse of drugs, full council on Wednesday the 9th. I will be seeing a limited number of clients in Britain that week. I give my time every month to this experience, though, because I'm aware that many people out there can't afford the help and support they need. So this is one little thing that we can do to give back, and I hope I've given something that's been useful to you today. If you didn't get a question asked today and you'd like to ask one next time, you can email it via Letting the Light In. You can also follow me on Twitter at Addiction Expert, and I really am over time. So blessings to everybody. Thank you for joining us, and I'll see you next time.